I've been in the business for 3 decades plus, and even the small microaggressions over 30 years become very weighty. It's like grains of sand on the beach.
One of the things I'm really, really keen on is the idea of taking shame out of these conversations. If we're going to move forwards, we all have to accept that we're not going to get everything right. We're not going to be perfect in every action that we take. But if we do nothing, that is the only real failure.
Hi, I'm Noeli and welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking to Bill Forchion and Vicki Amedume. They both have so much experience within circus, from being performers to becoming true leaders within the circus industry. They drop a whole bunch of knowledge within this video. Vicki is the founder and artistic director of Upswing, and she has a whole bunch of achievements. And Bill also has a whole bunch of achievements and is the founder of Dreamcatcher Entertainment and is also the camp director for Circus. And you can pause the screen right here to look at all of their glory. In this video, I asked Vicki if she has faced any barriers being a director who is a woman of color. We touch on Bill's experience with Cirque du Soleil, how Circus managed to hold their summer camp safely during COVID-19, and what companies should be looking to change. So make sure to watch all the way through. And if you like anything they say, please make sure to give this video a like too. And if you want to continue to keep up with this docuseries and my circus adventures, please subscribe and ring that bell so that you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. So let's start off with one of their experiences with racism.
How many years in, with all of the work that I've done and, all of the successful touring, the awards, everything that I've done, I've achieved, I still have people questioning whether I should be in the space and whether I've earned it or not. And then a few years ago, I remember I was awarded this thing called the Cloth Leadership Fellowship. It's an amazing program that runs in the UK, and it's a really, really competitive program. I think each year when I did it, about 200 people would apply and they'd select 20. For me, it was an amazing moment, and receiving that vote of support and investment and the opportunity to grow in that way. And I remember announcing it on Facebook, and somebody sent me a message essentially saying I'd only got it because I was black.
There's a lot there. Well, I will say that I saw Cirque du Soleil in 1988 for the first time with the show that had no name. It was before Cirque Reinventé came back to New York. And I went, oh my goodness, that's what I do. That's where I belong. I also looked at the performers on that stage and I did not see anyone of color. That didn't deter me because I knew that that's where I belonged. And I auditioned for Cirque in the early 90s. I auditioned 4 times, each time making it all the way through. I was on the list. It wasn't until 1998 that I was hired. So 10 years after seeing the first show is when they hired me to work on Saltimbanco. One of the things, so I spoke with somebody who had been there for each of those casting sessions when I was in the company, and we could speak frankly. And one of the things he had said to me was that he would love to have hired me before, that I was brilliant and fantastic. He said, we couldn't hire you for a creation, because if we hire you and you create a character and an act or something in our show, then how are we going to replace you? So the idea that I could only be replaced by a person of color that matched what I did, that was the narrow thinking in there. It was a great sigh of relief for me to hear that, because I had said this to others. I said, they're not hiring blacks. And people would say, oh, come on, they just hire the best, which also means that if there's no black there and they're only hire the best, then being black meant that I could not be the best. That's one of the microaggressions. But it was also nice to hear that from within. And when I say nice, to set those fears down and go, yeah, I wasn't hired because I was black.
And this is one of the interesting things about circus, that even with racism, it still feels like family, which makes things very complicated.
It's a double-edged sword, because I am also so very grateful for having had the Cirque du Soleil experience. I am so grateful for going through the Asia Pacific tour with them. That is a very important part of my life. And also awakening to what happens in that company was a very important part of my life and my development.
I love this industry. I stayed with Circus so long because I watch Circus now and it still makes my heart leap. You know, when you see exceptional performers, I'm getting emotional just thinking about it because I haven't actually seen any live Circus for so long. We function in a community where we really hold on to the idea of, you know, Circus being a meritocracy. If you have the skills, you will always rise to the top. And I don't think it's true. You know, it's not true in general society, and we're part of general society. It's not true in Circus. I know so many hugely talented Black, Brown, Indigenous artists who don't work or don't work very often. And it's not because they're not skilled, it's just because they don't fit somehow. You know, and whether people articulate that as discrimination and racism or not, it still has the same effect of being discriminatory.
I asked Vicki if she has faced any barriers being a director who is a woman of color.
Gosh, yes. There are a lot of barriers that you encounter that are present for different reasons. And sometimes, you know, it's hard to identify exactly what the challenge is. Is it a problem with me? Is it a problem with the context? Or is it just that I'm not equipped to deal with this challenge? I think one of our big problems is that people think of success, they think of leadership, and they think of talent. And the default setting, unfortunately, is still white male. If you look at our industry, there's a huge number of women in our industry, huge. But they tend to operate within education or in the smaller companies. As you go into bigger and bigger companies where potentially more money is at stake, you start to see the proportion of women reduce. You start to see the proportion of cultural and ethnic diversity reduce. And all of those other characteristics around which we form identity and discriminate against each other, you know, queer identity, disability, etc., that reduces because we are moving into a space where our society structure starts not to recognize leadership in those forms.
And this idea of what a leader should look like that is prevalent in society is a subtle microaggression. And this is why microaggressions are harmful.
It's a backhanded compliment. Wow, I've never seen a Black person do what you do before. And that sounds great, but I know there's more than just me out there. So racism doesn't always look like racism. Racism doesn't always look like outright disrespect. It doesn't look like outright anger or frustration or an outright offense. Sometimes it's a subtle thing. It's a backhanded compliment. Sometimes it's a passive-aggressive attack. And I've been in the business for quite some time, a few decades, 3 decades plus. And even the small microaggressions over 30 years become very weighty. It's like grains of sand on the beach. And each grain doesn't really amount to anything. But if you were to take in that whole beach and think about all the grains that are there and those little microaggressions that are happening each day of life, and I do mean each day, there's rarely a day that goes by where there isn't that confrontation. And many of them I push aside and keep moving forward because I have a purpose.
Another subtle practice in this industry is tokenism, and this is why it's harmful.
It shifts you from being an individual, a creative individual with ideas and personal agency, to being a representative, you know, and that can come with a restriction in your freedom to express yourself, which I think is really problematic, is a really unhealthy thing to push on an artist. So when you're a token or the only in the space, there's this vacuum around you of all of the other stuff that's missing that can somehow restrict you from being an individual and not allow you to kind of fully express who you are as a complex human being, you know. And that's what we all want as artists, is the opportunity to kind of explore the complexity of being human, the complexity of being an artist, rather than to represent something that might not kind of be completely authentic for us.
And here's a necessary change that needs to be made.
What if we write characters as archetypes and we could cast them with whatever look and whatever abilities fit that character? What if the people who were casting were coming from those different avenues and saying, hey, I'd like to see more people in wheelchairs in this production, or I'd like to see more amputees, or that just fit all these abilities, as opposed to, I need to see the best white person for this job, or I need to see somebody who's of color who's outstanding for this job. And even that, there is a disparity when we say, if it's a person of color, then they have to supersede all others before they can even be considered for that position, as opposed to everyone being looked at and judged or scaled in a similar manner. So that's what I see as the change that's necessary, is that we just open these doors.
And this is why it's difficult to make this change.
There's an idea of what the audience will want that's formed by looking at what has been successful before. And what has been successful before might not have been successful because it was the best option. It might just have been successful because it was the only thing that was out there and available, and managed to be a hit. So I think as you get into spending and investing more and more money into work, you start to become more and more risk adverse. The more a business becomes risk adverse, the more likely it is to miss opportunities and to fail. Because business is about investing in the new idea that you haven't really had yet. It's about kind of staying ahead of what the demand is and not just kind of servicing the demand that was there 5, 10, 15 years ago. So when people talk about the idea that in order for a show to be successful, it has to have these particular ingredients, I tend to disagree, and I think the creative industries should be ahead of the curve and not behind it, recognizing that we are living in a society that is demanding something different than what it's always been given.
And here's an example of how people of color have to adapt due to the lack of risk-taking by these companies.
I started out as a clown and realized really quickly that I couldn't get any work as a clown because brown clown just isn't a thing. I could get hired to work doing gigs in Harlem. I could get hired to work in certain neighborhoods, but no one was hiring me to go international. That was frustrating. So I transitioned into being an acrobat. At least I could be strong. And I knew that that's what I could do. But could I say anything about not being hired for being of color? No, because then I really wouldn't get hired.
And this fear of being blacklisted is prevalent in our industry. And this is why this fear needs to be crushed.
One of the things I'm really, really keen on is the idea of taking shame out of these conversations, for everybody, that if we're going to move forwards, we all have to accept that we're not going to get everything right. We're not going to be perfect in every action that we take. But if we do nothing, that is the only real failure.
And this is why it is important to be conscious of the voices that we lift up in Circus.
Because we're going to hear new voices. We're going to get new perspectives. I can't see how that doesn't benefit everyone. If you are trying to find a market and you are eliminating a whole sector of the community and you invite one person in that opens that sector up for you, why not?
Right now in the UK, there are more Black female aerialists than I can count on the fingers of one hand, like many, many more. Professional, working in the sector, making a living. And I think that's amazing. That's amazing because now you can really see them stand out as individuals rather than be forced to be representative of an identity, And the same is true for South and East Asian performers. We're starting to see more disabled performers coming through and kind of forging professional careers. I think it's just what has to happen.
And now I would like to share with you what Bill's been up to and how he helped to make the Circus Smirkus Summer Camp happen safely during COVID-19.
As I say, I get teary now, we did the impossible. We trusted each other. We trusted ourselves. We came up with guidelines with our leadership team to come up with guidelines working with the CDC, the Vermont Department of Health. And we looked at what guidelines they had in place, and we decided how we could implement protocols and practices within our camp to achieve those things. Hand sanitizer stations everywhere. Our coaches really stepped up with cleaning equipment, sanitizing equipment, and disinfecting equipment. And how do we make it work is we came up with what was necessary to keep this place safe, and then passed on that information to families, passed it on to our staff. You can do either 7-day quarantine and a negative COVID test or 14 days quarantine without the test, without the symptoms. And some people actually did the 14 days and did a negative test. So they went above and beyond because everyone wanted to see it succeed. We had to create that bubble, and only one person was going in and out of that bubble. And that was because we had to purchase things, and he followed the protocols that were necessary. That's how we made it work. And that's it in a really tiny nutshell. There's a lot more to it.
It's very heartwarming to hear this news, and please keep an eye out for Vicki's company Upswing as well. They create art that is so needed and so different from what we normally see in circus. And they have some exciting plans in the mix, developing a national and international program of work with diverse artists. So make sure to watch out for Upswing. And as we turn inwardly toward our own organizations, I'd like to talk about what we should be looking to change.
There are a lot of discussions that are out there, and I have jumped into many of these discussions. I've also stepped away from a few when I realized that I do bring something to the table, but it was not necessarily valued at what I bring to the table, just that I was sitting at the table was what was valued. And that, once again, words that I've said about some of the problems that are out there and some of the disparities that are out there were and are not heard.
I want to see circus that feels like it's relevant to the world and what's going on now. And if it stays monocultural, and if it stays really inward looking and doesn't invite a variety of people in and a variety of ideas in, I really worry that as an art form and a community that we're going to just be left behind.
I feel so lucky to be able to talk with Bill and Vicki, and I'm so inspired by them, and I bet you are too. So please go follow them on their social media and keep up with them. And I will also be linking their websites in the description box down below, so you can do a thorough stalking of them. Please feel free to comment and let me know one thing that you took away from this video. I love to hear from you, and I try to respond to all of my comments. And if you want to keep up with this docuseries, please subscribe and ring that bell so that you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. And I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye!